Hi, everyone. We're just making sure everyone gets admitted. Um, just give a minute or two for people to join. Um, all right, thanks, everyone. I'm Ann Stauffer. I'm co-president of the DC League, and I really appreciate everyone coming to our discussion about what our status is now in terms of what we call the occupation of DC. We have two great speakers with us. We have Vanessa Batters Thompson, who's Executive Director of DC Appleseed Center for Law and Justice, and Professor Brianna C. Gray, Assistant Professor, Department of Government and Politics at the University of Maryland. But before we start, I just wanted to, before we start with sort of official discussions, I just wanted to do what Ann Anderson, my lead colleague, always says, is everyone should just sit with their feet on the floor, center themselves, take a deep breath. Things have been pretty challenging lately. And because we're about to talk about challenging things, and I want to say, like, who here has seen the National Guard hanging around as you live your normal everyday life in the district? You can just raise your hands. And who has seen an ICE action with either MPD or other federal law enforcement support in their neighborhood? How many? Anyone directly seen it? Yeah. So we are all affected. So I don't know if people are doing, people have been doing lots of things in response to where we are now. And so people have been banging pots, several of us. I don't know if I know some of my neighbors are supporting the unhoused neighbors, the ones who've been sort of shunted around. People have been redirecting traffic away from checkpoints. People have been going to the Hill to talk to Congresspeople. People are getting to know their families and are getting their family and friends to contact congressmen. And I know my husband and I have been definitely working to be more present and more in our community than we have been before. So, so in this conversation, Vanessa and Brianna will review the attacks on and the risks to our self-government, and then we can discuss options for action. So first, Vanessa with DC Appleseed will review the status of DC's occupation based on the different authorities, the emergency that expired, and the mayor's executive order that was in response to that, the federal surge of ICE and other law enforcement, and the National Guard deployment. And then after Vanessa shares her view of that, we'll have a time for question and answer, because these are very specific situations. Thank you. All right, Vanessa.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Anne. And thank you to Ann Anderson, as well as Barbara, for inviting me to be here today. Can everybody hear me okay? Great. I'm now going to try to share my screen, which sometimes goes beautifully, sometimes does not. Can everybody see that? All right. So far, so good. All right. We're off to a great start. Well, thank you again for having me tonight. And I'm excited to go over what the federal takeover of the district really looked like when you break it down. Before we get into the three types of the takeover, I just want to provide a real quick background to remind everybody where we've been over the past month. And here we have a quote from the president back on August 11th when they released the executive order that really started the recent surge or takeover, whichever term you prefer to use, within DC. I think one thing that I want everybody here to recognize is that the quote doesn't completely align with what I think was the average experience of DC residents. I don't know about you all, but I didn't see bloodshed, bedlam, squalor, or worse. I saw my community. But that was the basis on which the emergency was started. In reality, we were not in a crime emergency. Certainly, there was crime. There was certainly room for improvement in some aspects of DC's justice system, but we were well beyond a peak of violent crime that occurred in 2022 post pandemic, which frankly many cities experienced, not just DC. And there has been some question about the data and whether MPD's data is accurate. But I want folks to take a quick look at this survey that was done by Washington Post and George Mason School of Policy. And it shows what residents' perspectives were, specifically their level of concern about specific offenses. And as you can see from this chart, DC residents didn't perceive that we were in a crime crisis. In fact, they understood us to be in an improving circumstance. With that said, the crime emergency was used as a basis to launch 3 different surges. One was an attempted takeover of the Metropolitan Police Department. The second was the deployment of the National Guard. And the third was the increased presence of federal police forces. And DC residents from the beginning have overwhelmingly opposed all 3 aspects of that surge. So the reason this was possible, the reason this looked totally different in DC than it did in other jurisdictions, is because DC is not a state. We have the Home Rule Act, which gives us some rights to govern ourselves, but it does stop short of statehood. And it does permit DC to elect its own mayor, its own legislature, and our own attorney general, but Congress can always overrule any laws passed by DC and retains oversight of DC's budget, among other things. One of the, if not initially intended, but side consequences of that unique structure of government is over time, the federal government has actually had an increasingly large role in our justice system. In part in an effort to help DC balance its revenues against its expenses, the federal government actually operates large swaths of our criminal justice system. MPD is local, but it has cooperative agreements with 33 other federal law enforcement agencies operating in DC at any time. Our courts are federal. Initially, we didn't even have local courts. Eventually, we were given our own courts, but they're still federal courts. And the federal government actually appoints our judges with suggestions or recommendations from the Judicial Nominating Commission. The U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia is appointed by the president, and many of DC's criminal justice agencies, including our pretrial agency, our parole agency, and our prisons, are all run by the federal government. So there's always some element of the federal government in our law enforcement system, which made this surge uniquely powerful in DC. So let's talk first about the attempted takeover of MPD. So this is explicitly permitted by the Home Rule Act. Under the Home Rule Act, the president, if he determines that special conditions of an emergency nature exists, may direct DC's mayor to provide services. No president has ever used this provision under the Home Rule Act, even during large-scale emergencies such as 9/11 and January 6, 2021. So while the plain language of the Home Rule Act permitted President Trump to request MPD support, what actually happened was a bit more insidious. Initially, the president and the U.S. Attorney General actually attempted to replace the leadership of the Metropolitan Police Department. They additionally attempted to put new policies in place. It was only when the DC's elected Attorney General, Brian Schwab, filed suit in federal district court, which happened on August 15th, that they backed down from this. The federal government reached an agreement with DC's Office of the Attorney General, under which DC would maintain control of the police department. The current status of the MPD takeover is that it's technically over. President Trump's authority to control MPD ended earlier in September. This is because the Home Rule Act only permits the president to request the support of MPD for up to 30 days before a joint resolution of Congress must be passed to extend it. There was never even a vote on this. It was clear that it would not pass in the Senate. The House never brought it to the floor. One thing I would note is that just because the takeover is over for now, the MPD takeover, it's unclear what would happen if the president decided to declare another emergency. And there has been some back and forward between the mayor and the federal government about, in particular, MPD involvement in immigration enforcement by ICE and Border Patrol, and there have been threats by the president that he might reinstate it. Additionally, community and civil rights groups are still receiving reports of MPD working with federal agents. So the status on this is a little uncertain, but it is officially over at this time. Let's move on and talk a little bit about the National Guard. So a lot of people find it confusing that the National Guard from other states would be deployed to DC. So under federal and DC law, the president is the commander-in-chief of DC National Guard. To that end, he can always deploy DC's troops in DC. With regards to troops from other states, he used a provision that permits him to request additional support from other governors. And he asked multiple governors, but the governors of 6 states responded by sending troops. It is worth knowing that as of yesterday, those governors are starting to recall their troops. South Carolina yesterday announced that they would be calling their troops back. I anticipate that we will shortly see troops from other states be recalled. And I think one of the big reasons we're going to see that is there has been a lot of discomfort, I think, among the troops that were deployed to DC about their role. There was a Department of Defense memorandum that was leaked that sort of gauged the attitudes of troops on the ground, and there were very mixed feelings and deep concerns among many of them about how their deployment was being perceived by the local community. The other thing that has been in the news a lot and that has concerned many people, not just in DC, is the fact that the National Guard has been used for basically landscaping support on national parks. They've been picking up trash. They've been spreading mulch and raking, and that's been widely photographed and in the news. And I think there have been pressure on governors of other jurisdictions about whether this is the best use of their state's National Guard. There have also been concerns about the cost of the deployment. No one will know the exact cost of the deployment until it's over, but it's been estimated at anywhere from $1 million to $1.8 million a day for just the National Guard. So this is a very expensive way to spread mulch. And so I believe we'll start seeing this tapering down, but at this point, the deployment is still ongoing for 5 of the 6 other jurisdictions that sent troops. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about federal agencies and police. And this is probably the most complex aspect of this deployment for the reason I cited at the beginning of my presentation. Because of DC's unique governmental status and the way that DC's law enforcement is always intertwined with the federal government's law enforcement agencies, it is a lot harder to draw a clear line here. And this is also the area where I think many DC residents have found, or the area that most DC residents have found incredibly disconcerting. Not that it's not disconcerting to see the military deployed in the city, but there have been really scary anecdotal stories as well as recorded videos of interactions between federal agencies and federal police with local DC residents. And this looks like a variety of different things. We have seen checkpoints. We've also seen police arresting people in unmarked clothing, unmarked vehicles, sometimes even with face masks. So let's look at that real quick. So these are the checkpoints. And I think for many of us, the idea of having to show a police officer your ID to go about your business, often people are being asked to show immigration documentation at these checkpoints. It feels un-American. It doesn't feel comfortable. And that has been one of the aspects that I think has really disrupted the flow of the city. Here are some images of what the arrests by federal officers in DC have looked like. And I mentioned masks. If you look at the picture on the left, this is an example of what community members are reporting. There are people in street clothes with maybe a flak jacket that says police, but doesn't necessarily say who they are police for, what agency, often with their faces covered up. And that has been, I think, for many people, the most traumatic aspect of this deployment. Unfortunately, it's also the aspect of the deployment that is hardest to say this has come to an end, this hasn't ended, this is ongoing. Because at some level, there will always be federal police in DC. That doesn't mean there's nothing we can do. And I'm going to stop my slides here. There are legislative solutions to this. There are also judicial solutions to this. Just today, we learned that a group of civil rights organizations and immigration legal services organizations have filed a lawsuit against ICE for these exact tactics and the types of arrests they're doing in the city. But because it's not illegal or frankly different, although it's a different degree than what is happening in the city on a normal basis, we have to sort of attack the parts of it that we dislike individually versus attacking the entire deployment. And so it's going to be a much longer term challenge to push back on this issue than it will be to push back on the MPD control or the National Guard. So I'm going to stop there. I'm happy to answer any questions, or we can wait till the end.
Yeah, thanks, Vanessa. I think we should take questions now because these are very specific things.
Sure.
And if I may, I'm going to ask the first, and I think I'm going to ask whoever's moderating, Jess, if you want to take questions in the chat, or if there are few of us enough that people just can raise their hands. Jess, how would you like to do that?
I think people should use the raise hand function in Zoom, so that automatically orders the questions, and then we can call on you to unmute when it's your turn to ask a question.
Okay, great. And the raise hand function is at the bottom under React. Hit the little heart and you should get a raise hand option. So actually, Vanessa, my question is, how does the mayor's executive order fit into that? Because people got very upset about it. She seemed to pitch it as a strategy for ending the emergency takeover. Can you speak to that?
Yeah. So part of the backdrop to the most recent executive orders issued in August is a prior executive order that was issued in March called the Safe and Beautiful DC order, or Safe and Beautiful DC is how we refer to it in shorthand, but it's slightly different wording. And that required basically a coalition of officials and law enforcement leaders from DC, Maryland, and Virginia, as well as park leadership, to all work together to improve the safety of DC. So while that executive order came out closer in time to the August executive orders, I think it was the mayor's way of saying that we're going to be part of the team that is working on this larger safe and beautiful DC effort. I think in some ways it was a show of reassurance for the federal government that they did not need to pass the extension of the MPD takeover. It was like, hey, we're going to work with you. I think from the mayor's perspective, in some way, what they put on paper in that executive order is the status quo prior to the takeover. Like DC has a criminal justice coordinated council whose role it is to ensure, the US Attorney's Office is working with the Office of the Attorney General, who is working with the FBI. Any given day, there is a degree of collaboration. One thing that was not in that executive order and has frankly been a point of contention since then was that DC would work with ICE or Border Patrol. And so I think it was in some ways a tactical move. In some ways, it was documenting practices that were already occurring. And I think the timing made it a bit more confusing, but it did not provide the federal government any assurances that we would work with agencies that we did not work with prior to the surge.
All right, thank you, Vanessa.
Yeah.
Anna, I see your hand. So you need to unmute.
Yep.
There you go.
I came in, I'm sorry, a little bit late on this because I've just had to move. I'm wondering where the key areas where the militia are focused. What areas of DC are they focused? In what areas?
Yeah. So that's one of the frustrating contradictions of this entire surge being based on crime. They are not based in the areas of the city with the highest crime rates. The National Guard specifically has been located in the federal core, by which I mean, the National Mall, by Congress, by the White House, as well as the Metro. I hear all the time from people, and they're really, really concentrated at the Union Station, right? So I think the National Guard in some way are serving a visual role. They are not serving anything close in most cases to a law enforcement role. And as I said, they have been doing some landscaping work, like picking up litter and spreading mulch, which is a bit frustrating because the people who used to do that work had their jobs cut by the federal government earlier this year.
I'm sorry, let me ask one more question. I heard at a recent meeting of the screening of my film that some people would describe drones flying over homes at night. Did you hear anything about that?
I have not heard drones. I will say it is increasingly common for even local law enforcement to use drones. I think both DC and Montgomery County use drones at this point, I believe. However, I do know that a consistent complaint during the surge has been helicopters. There seem to be particularly many more Park Police helicopters than usual. Park Police have played a really unusual role in this surge. Both the helicopters, as well as they've often worked with immigration and customs enforcement on park roads. So a lot of people don't realize how many roads in this area are owned and managed by Park Police, like GW Parkway, you've got Rock Creek Parkway, you've got Suitland Parkway. Those are all Park Police jurisdiction. And a lot of vehicles have been pulled over. And then once a preliminary screening is done, very often folks in a black vehicle with unmarked sort of flak jackets step in and check immigration paperwork.
So mainly immigration. They're mainly checking on immigration?
They seem to be focused on immigration. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think when they were reporting on the arrests, there were some other sort of more typical crime arrests too, but
Absolutely. I mean, we are seeing federal agents arrest DC residents for what I would call like quality of life crimes, like an open container of alcohol, jaywalking, things like that, which you wouldn't normally see a federal agent doing.
right, yeah. In the past, they used to have more important things to worry about, right? So Jess, I see your hand. Anna's comment reminded me, for folks who came in, after we initially started, we are recording this meeting so that those who couldn't make it today can also benefit from all of this. So Jess, did you have a question?
Yeah, I wanted to read a question that I thought that came up in the chat that I thought should be elevated. So Shelley asks, I understand that Chief Smith has said MPDs should still cooperate with ICE, which based on her understanding is not legal under DC law. So is it illegal or legal for MPD to be cooperating with ICE in this current environment? And thank you,
So the
Shelley, for that
mayor,
question.
yeah, the mayor has said that they should not be collaborating with ICE. If Chief Smith has said something different, I have not heard that. It's possible. As I said, while the mayor has made multiple public statements since the end of the 30-day MPD emergency that DC's police force will not be supporting ICE operations, there is tension there. And the president has said he may restart, a new emergency on that basis. There are also a lot of reports coming from the community that this is still happening. So it wouldn't shock me if I learned that there was perhaps a disconnect and some mixed messaging within the police force, but I have not myself heard the statement from Chief Smith that you're referring to.
And also, I'm not an expert in this part of the law, but in reading all the articles about this, I mean, DC has some level of cooperation with ICE when it's actual criminal work. I mean, they've always had some level of cooperation, but they didn't cooperate in these sort of broader raids. And I think so. Again, it's murky. I guess it would say it's murky. But I have also heard that people are reporting that MPD seems to still be cooperating. So
there have certainly been a lot of reports of MPD working with federal agents and ICE arrests happening with MPD in the vicinity. And it may come down to your exact, understanding of the word work with. Yeah.
Okay. So we have Ann Anderson has a question.
Yeah.
There. Okay. So thinking about statehood, would any of these ongoing ways of coordinating, cooperating, with the federal government be different if we were a state?
Yeah, 100%. So in the 1990s, DC went through a period of financial struggle. And it eventually became clear during what we'll call the control board era, where the federal government had a greater role in the management of DC's finances, as well as they got into all kinds of other stuff, that basically the balance sheet in DC does not work, right? We are restricted on the types of revenues we can collect by virtue of the Home Rule Act. And we also perform the functions of both a city and a state. So like our balance sheet is really tricky compared to other jurisdictions, given the restrictions on revenue and the sort of two roles that the DC government play. And the way that that was resolved under what was called the Revitalization Act that passed in, I believe, 1997, was the federal government took on some roles of the criminal justice system that they did not have responsibility for before. And many of those are in our criminal justice system, right? The other thing that is just very unique about DC is we don't appoint our own judges. We don't have full power to appoint our judges. We have a small role right now under the Judicial Nominating Commission. It's an important role, but end of the day, the president picks from the nominees the JNC puts forward, and the Senate has to confirm it. We're always short on judges in DC because the Senate does not confirm enough judges. And then there's a third part of this, which is that in DC, our attorney general, our elected attorney general, Brian Schwab, does not handle the majority of felonies that occur in DC. He handles a small array of misdemeanors, a couple minor felonies, but mostly just juvenile crimes. And so we have a federal prosecutor who's not at all accountable to DC residents prosecuting the majority of crimes. And that means that basically we don't control large swaths of our criminal justice system. And so, I don't think that you would ever have the federal government in the same position of power over a state that they are with DC. Additionally, because there's always this threat that Congress can take away our Home Rule Act, it's really hard for us to negotiate disagreements between the federal government and DC's locally elected officials. The power dynamics are way off when something like this surge occurs. Finally, the irony of the MPD takeover being sort of governed by Congress, or them being the backstop on an extended MPD takeover, is not lost on anybody who works in this space, because we don't have a vote in Congress. DC residents do not have a vote in the very entity that makes the decision to overrule our locally elected officials. So this is like a situation that could not happen anywhere else in the US. And I'd like to point to Chicago as an example of a city that had the power to respond assertively and did. I mean, they literally drove out their snow plows and blocked the roads into the city so that the National Guard can't come in. We can't do that. We are just not in a position of autonomy and strength that a state is. So this is just absolutely purely related to our status under Home Rule. And of course, the Home Rule Act was passed instead of giving DC statehood because of, frankly, racism. You can't really get around that. There was so much racism and fear about crime in a majority minority city that led to the passage of the Home Rule Act. And you sort of see that replicating itself here, right? All the cities that President Trump said he planned to send the National Guard into or send federal troops into were Black-led cities. So I think there's some themes here that you see from the era that the Home Rule Act was passed, and we're seeing played out again here. It was a really long answer to your question, Anne, but you asked a great question.
Thank you.
Right. And if anyone's curious, the DC Fiscal Policy Institute did a study that said that we can afford statehood, including absorbing the cost of our the federally run judicial system. So it's a great study. We can put it in the notes at some point. Maybe not, I don't have it up, but we'll send it around at some point. Jess.
All right, I'm here with some more questions from the chat. Linda, I'm going to combine a couple questions together because they're about the numbers. So we kind of, Vanessa, you opened your talk with kind of maybe there's a difference between the rationale for the surge and then the numbers and DC perception. So, so there's this question. The first part of the question is, have you seen a breakdown of news stats? So the kind of information that's being used to show that this worked, showing a reduction in crime. And then someone else, then Shelley commented, right, that the White House reported this great success in taking illegal guns off the street, and yet those numbers appeared to be much lower than actually the normal number that MPD would have been taking with their normal strategies and activities. And so I was just kind of curious, do we have numbers that relate back to the effectiveness of this this surge?
Yeah, so we don't have great numbers. We have some like selected numbers that the White House released. Unfortunately, we don't have any numbers related to immigration, really. They're very murky, very hard to independently verify. We have poor numbers related to juveniles because those are not publicly available records. But this is what I would say about numbers. Two things. One, it is really easy to crack down on crime if you don't care about civil liberties, right? Like if you don't care who gets hurt, whose rights are violated, you can arrest people all day. End of the day, this is a surge when you have more people serving that sort of visible law enforcement function, as well as more people enforcing whatever laws they choose, you're going to see an increase of arrests. But arrests alone are not equivalent to public safety, right? We just got out of a period where we kind of realized like maybe mass incarceration isn't really the best avenue to public safety. We're sort of being a bit retro here by treating arrests as equivalent to public safety. In reality, I would argue we are significantly less safe than we were going into this surge for one big reason. The trust that our community has lost for MPD and our law enforcement system will take years and years and years to regain, okay? Particularly within the immigrant community, you are going to see people so reluctant to report basic everyday crimes like domestic violence because what could happen to them. And so we have really eroded anything close to the community trust that would be required for what I call evidence-based gun violence reduction programs, which DC has been trying for years to stand up, but really rely on communities trusting law enforcement. For years, DC has been trying to put police officers like on streets in different parts of DC to build these relationships between officers and our community. We've undone it in like a month. And it's really devastating to see. The other thing I would say is that if the federal government had wanted to genuinely just reduce crime in DC, they had a million better options to do so. They could have confirmed our judges. They could have reversed all the cuts that they made in this year's budget to gun violence reduction programs. They could have reversed cuts related to FEMA, and there's a cities grant for safety in cities that they could just reverse. There are also a variety of victim services grants that the Department of Justice has cut recently. And one thing that always comes back to me is that, public safety looks very different depending on where you're standing and on the eye of the beholder. And what we're doing by arresting people and taking them out of communities has downstream consequences. And I just think we've set ourselves up for a period of regression on our criminal justice issues and public safety that is in no way going to balance out against the few arrests that we got here. Finally, I would note that at the same time that the federal government was claiming that they were pulling guns off the street, the U.S. Attorney for D.C., Jeanine Pirro, announced that she would no longer prosecute high-capacity magazines in the District of Columbia or like huge rifles. So this is just not what our local population would view as public safety, desirable justice outcomes, or frankly, effective gun enforcement.
Thanks. Just a couple of thoughts to that. I think when Vanessa says we have eroded trust, I want to say that that's not we, the district. I would say that that is the administration's emphasis in the surge and their misplaced, emphasis on this policing crackdown, which was not necessary and is not helping. I also think it's important, like as the, I also think the second thing to important is like, there's one thing to arrest people, there's another thing to actually see if that was a valid arrest. And if you look at what the courts are doing, they're throwing cases out because, as you said, it's easy to, if you ignore civil liberties, it's easy to arrest a bunch of people. And finally, and then I think we'll move on to Brianna. But finally, I want to point out for the league, we actually, and we have a one pager that talks about this. I think it's really important to really emphasize that this occupation of DC is not about crime, right? It's about getting people used to having policing and military policing, you know, the federal government presence and policing in US cities, acting against the population of US cities. And so, you know, one of the things we talk about here at the league is that, you know, it's not about crime. If they would also have given us our $1 billion that they stopped us from spending in our last year's budget if they really were worried about public safety and support. So that's why we don't actually focus on the crime statistics. Thanks, Vanessa. We'll have probably time for extra questions if they come up, but Brianna was going to talk about and look at another risk to our safety, if you want to think about it that way. It definitely is. There are 12 bills in Congress that would federalize different parts of DC government, along with and then she was also going to talk about the existing law on the control board that Vanessa mentioned, and the context of the previous history of the control board and what it meant that DC, for a good amount of time, you know, had sort of federal control over our decision making, even though we had home rule. And then we'll also talk about the likelihood of the control board being reinstated. So Brianna, please.
Trying to share my screen here. Give me just a moment. Here we go.
We can see it. We just need you to put it in presentation mode. Yep. There you go.
Wonderful. Hello, and thank you again for having me and for bringing this important discussion to the forefront. I am also a DC resident, so I'm a university professor in another state, but I live in the district. And so this is obviously significant for me as well. And so I'm very happy to be here and very happy to discuss this important topic. So I wanted to just provide a brief agenda. I do this everywhere that I go. And so I just wanted to walk us through where we're going in this really short presentation, I promise. But I wanted to give just a general overview of the Home Rule Act, because I think when we talk about the challenges that are coming from the legislative branch, we really are seeing that it's addressing each of the parts within the Home Rule Act. And so I want us to parallel the things that are, you know, prominent in that Home Rule Act, and then to see the parallels between that and what we're seeing coming from members of Congress. Then I wanted to briefly touch on, because Vanessa did a fantastic job in doing this as well, but I wanted to briefly touch on the federal government's oversight capacity and some of the constitutional authorities that are given to Congress vis-a-vis Article 1 to, you know, oversee what the district does. And then lastly, I would end on some of the legislation, the specific legislation that members of Congress have introduced within the past 2 months to really place a front to DC Home Rule. So in starting with the DC Home Rule Act and some of the historical background with it, as well as the parts to it, I wanted to just place emphasis on the fact that this is an act of Congress. And many Washingtonians, not us, of course, because we're here and we're informed on these sorts of topics, but many people are sort of not familiar with the relationship between DC and and the federal government. So I want to bring your attention to a book, and I'll put this in the chat, but it's a book that talks about Washington, D.C. and the history of Washington, D.C. It's a great text. I don't have any dog in this fight. This is a colleague from a different university, but it's talking specifically about the origin story of D.C. Back to its founding. And so in drawing your attention to Public Law 93, this was an act of Congress signed on December 24th of 1973, and it gave really 5 parts to it. The first detail about the act that was passed is that it created a city council. It defined the members of that council, and it outlined the powers of its members. The second part of the act, it essentially outlined the authorities of the DC mayor and the qualifications and powers and duties of the mayor, as well as dictated the cycle of elections, and importantly, gave credence to the role of the chief financial officer. Part C of the act defined the judicial powers, which we'll see as far as the new legislation that members are deriving. This is a direct sort of contrast to this authority granted in the Home Rule Act. But anyway, in Part C, we see the definition of the judicial powers, the nomination powers, and Vanessa also mentioned this. And then Part D, in that it outlines the district's budget, which in talking about the control board, this is something that has major implications for the federal government, because the federal government has a large part of authority in granting funds to the district's budget and the district government. Part E, it details the borrowing authorities of the DC government, so how it's able to collect appropriations for DC operations. And then lastly, the creation of independent agencies and authorities, such as the Board of Elections, the Board of Education, and some of the zoning commissions and water treatment and sewer authorities that DC has. So this is an overview of the Home Rule Act in very, very short, abbreviated version. So I encourage, us to all really familiarize ourselves with that, and make those parallels between the legislation that we're seeing come from Congress and the specific parts of the Home Rule Act that they are attempting to usurp. Okay, so in thinking about the federal government and the oversight capacity that the federal government has, we should look at 2 major things. And Vanessa did a fantastic job mentioning this as well, but I really want to focus here on the U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 8 of Clause 17. It's been called the Enclave Clause or the District Clause, and I'll just read here that the Congress has power to exercise exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever over such district not exceeding 10 miles square. It also says in the latter portion of this that the authority over such things that are built in the city. So not only is it having this authority over the district, but anything that has been built by the DC government, the Constitution essentially affords the authority to Congress vis-a-vis Article 1 to oversee. The second part that we could be thinking about in the way that Congress sort of has this oversight capacity is through the necessary and proper clause. And this is very, very standard. So I apologize if this is, if lawyers and legal professionals in the room are already familiar with this, but I want to point our attention to this, the U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18, which is where we see most of Congress's authorities derived from, the necessary and proper clause, which essentially says that anything, even if it's not enumerated in the Constitution, Congress has such authorities as long as it doesn't infringe upon other authorities in Article 2, Article 3, and the Bill of Rights. So when we're thinking about some of the congressional bills that are coming from, members of Congress through the Committee on Oversight and other committees, I want us to focus on some of the leaders of these charges. The House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform has been the primary vehicle through which much of this legislation is passed. In fact, on September the 10th, and I spoke about this to some of you the last time we were scheduled to have this meeting, but on September 10th, a major bill markup occurred in which 14 bills were essentially reviewed and pushed forward for legislative ruling, right? For members of Congress to deem either something that they would be interested in passing or referring back to their committees of jurisdiction. And so these are the 14 pieces of legislation. And I know I said 12 initially, we've seen some more come to the light, but these are the 14 pieces of legislation that members of Congress have introduced, and some of which have passed. So I'm going to go through each one of these, just a quick sort of overview and highlighting of these bills, because I want us to see the connections again with the DC Home Rule Act and how several parts of these acts, these new acts, are providing some major challenges for existing authority through the Home Rule Act. The bills here that are highlighted or marked in bold are the ones that have passed. So the DC Criminal Reform to immediately make everyone safer in DC Act, or the DC Crimes Act, has passed. The District of Columbia Juvenile Sentencing Reform Act has passed, as well as HR 5143, the District of Columbia Policing Protection Act. And then lastly, the District of Columbia Judicial Nominations Reform Act, HR 5125. So let's first look at the bills that have passed. Can you still see my slides?
Yes.
Okay. Is it in full view?
No, we got kind of
So
Okay.
designer view or whatever, the plan building
Okay.
view.
Excuse me. Oops.
Oh, now we're seeing presenter view. Now we have the slides.
Okay. So in thinking about the ones that have passed so far, it's really an affront to some of the major criminal legislation that we have in place in Washington, D.C. So on 9/16 of this year, we saw that the D.C. Criminal Reform to Immediately Make Everyone Safer Act was passed. Many of these bills have been passed through members of Congress who are not from the general vicinity or from, even the East Coast. So we've seen several members, and you'll see this in perpetuity, Representative Clay Higgins, who is a major player in some of the conversations that we've seen happen around home rule attacks. So HR 4922 essentially says that, there are, as Vanessa indicated, major challenges with DC crime. And so it places authority within the parameters and purview of Congress to make policy that would essentially improve the state of DC crime. So it gives Congress an additional authority to act in this way. HR 5125, the DC Judicial Nominations Reform Act, was passed a day later. And so this is obviously a priority for these legislators. And so this essentially puts out of DC residents' hands the ability to nominate justices or members to our judiciary in ways that have traditionally been DC residents, the way that DC residents have had the authority to do so in the past. Next, the HR 5143, the DC Policing Protection Act. It removes authorities that have existed in prior bills. So there was a bill passed in 2015 and also in 2022 that essentially provided constraints on the way that DC police can act. One of those being the ability to chase in high capacity chases through the district. It prevented or eliminated that possibility so that pedestrians and those, bystanders would not be affected by high-speed DC chases. And so this would essentially allow that to happen. Now, I will put a pin in this and say that these have been passed in the House of Representatives. As we know, vis-a-vis the basic understanding of legislation, this has to be passed in the Senate as well to become law. But the fact that it's been introduced and passed in the House this quickly is a strong indicator that there may be companion bills in the Senate that would then allow for expedited processing of this legislation. And then lastly, the DC Juvenile Sentencing Reform Act, which would essentially reduce the legal age for criminal offenses from 18 to 14. And so this obviously has a significant impact on the residents of the district through what we would call children, right? 14, and this is, I think, a questionable and arguable determination, but at 14 years old, this is a major life-changing bill for that demographic and for the parents of those juveniles. Okay, so these are the remaining pieces of legislation, and I'm actually going to refer to my notes here because I have a number of notes, and I'm happy to share the details. So I have in my notes when the bill passed, when it was introduced, who were the major players in the creation of these bills, as well as the status of the bill currently. But I wanted to just go through each of them, if that's okay, to see where they are. So we know that 4 bills have been passed in the House. They're now in the Senate for markups for review within their respective committees, but these are bills that remain in the House that we have some influence or the ability to influence as they are discussed and potentially marked up for placing on the House floor for a vote. Okay, so the first bill that we should perhaps pay more attention to is this DC District of Columbia Home Rule Act. And the way that we can think about this is essentially an assault on the existing parts of the DC Home Rule Act of 1973 that constrain the space and the protections granted to the DC Council and the DC government generally to act in ways that they have traditionally acted, to create their own budget, to be able to craft legislation and create agencies that can support the residents of the district. And so this is essentially a significant assault on the existing authorities that grant DC what we would call home rule. The second piece of legislation that has come to light, and this is something actually that was introduced by Representative Eleanor Holmes Norton in essentially creating a space for quick electronic transmission of bills, so that there isn't a delay in the traditional process, which is to essentially print out a bill. In a lot of ways, Congress is still a bit antiquated, but to essentially print out legislation and then to report it to Congress in these ways. And so this allows for the expediting of bills and any material that the District of Columbia has to submit legally to the federal government. This would essentially allow for the electronic transmittal of that. So this was, as I said, a bill introduced by our representative. HR 5103, the Make the District of Columbia Safe and Beautiful Act. Now, I've heard on this call so far conversation about some of the law enforcement agencies who are in the area who are essentially doing just this, right? They're taking graffiti down, they're picking up trash, but this is part of that initiative, right? It's part of the way that the federal government is asserting its authority into the cleanliness, if you will, of the district. But I would say here, one of the concerns about this bill and the Clean and Managed Spaces Act, it's further down on this list, HR 5163, is that it directly attacks our problem of unhoused communities. And so part of what is deemed unsafe or less than beautiful is the eyesore, I'm using quotation marks because this is not my language, but the eyesore that the unhoused communities are providing in certain spaces of the district. So these 2 pieces of legislation speak directly to the federal government's desire to implement policy that would allow for the federal government to work in this way. The District of Columbia Cash Bail Reform Act, this would completely revitalize the on the books legislation that provides DC with its ability to assess its own cash bail system, right? So this would completely usurp that authority and would allow for the federal government to have agency in influencing the way that we determine the state of our cash bail system. The Strong Sentences for Safer DC Streets Act essentially creates stronger opportunities for the federal government to change our policies and our law on DC sentencing. So it would remove from our judiciary and from essentially DC residents the ability to dictate whether the crime matches the punishment. And so in a lot of federal jurisdictions, in particular with this bill, in a lot of federal jurisdictions, there are mandatory sentences. So there are, sentences dependent upon the crime. And so it wants to put on par with some of the other jurisdictions the same legal framework for those sentences. The HR 5242, the repeal DC's Incarceration Reduction Act of 2016 and the second amendment of 2022. This is a complete overhaul of DC's carceral regulation. And I think one of the challenges here is that we have a really solid understanding of DC crime and the way that the system of law operates in DC. And so once we place that authority in the hands of a federal government where members of Congress are representing districts that are completely different from Washington, D.C., have completely different conditions of their districts with very different interests, it becomes a really strong challenge for the district to lobby in its own defense. I've already spoken about HR 5163, the Clean and Managed Spaces Act, which is really a way to craft legislation around the unhoused community. So, a lot of the public spaces that are existing in Washington, D.C. have had encampments that have emerged. And this law essentially is to address some of that activity. With regard to the DC SOAR Act, an improvement, this is to address education. So there are currently $60 million that are granted from the federal government to DC to manage our school system and to place monies in areas like special education or after school activities or special programs based on the need for a particular ward. And this would grant the federal government authority to oversee where those funds are attached. And then lastly, the last two here, the common sense law enforcement and accountability now in DC, another sort of way that the federal government wants to put its hand essentially in the way that law enforcement are held accountable. And a lot of this is to reduce the penalty for law enforcement agents for certain activities. This includes body camera footage, and when and where and how body camera footage can be used from the perspective of law enforcement. And then lastly, as we've seen, the District of Columbia Attorney General Appointment Reform Act, which has, major implications for the role of our DC Attorney General, which we know is essentially a significant position in how we think about our legal parameters. And so this would place a huge, a really sizable impact in the federal government for overseeing our DC government. And then I'll end with questions. I do want to just reemphasize that folks like Clay Higgins and others who've introduced this legislation have coalitions. They built caucuses, they created opportunities for legislating in bipartisan ways with some members who are in districts that are considered more red. And so, I think that the challenge here becomes how do DC residents reach out to those in blue states, those members of Congress in blue states who, may be able to create legislation that at least grants DC more authority than what is currently given in these bills. It's very likely that some of these will actually come to fruition in the way that companion bills and bipartisan or co-partisan bills are operating in both the House and the Senate. But I do think that there are ways to influence legislation through other members who are representing, I would say, bluer states, to have influence on the language and the wording of some of these pieces of legislation.
Yeah, thanks, Brianna. I mean, thanks for sort of laying that all out for us, and particularly the risks. It's a sort of salami tactics of taking away our home rule one bill at a time. So they don't even have to repeal our home rule. They just have to pass all these laws. And I think I want to point out that the last one you talked about with the AG one, that would actually, specifically what it does, we currently elect our attorney general, and this bill would make it so the president appoints our attorney. So we completely lose any control over who represents us in all these civil cases and other things. So it's like taking us back to pre-home rule days, slice by slice. And while we're definitely going to talk about action, but I guess this is also a good reminder to talk about how the League of Women Voters is nonpartisan. So we don't support any parties or political candidates, but we do have a lot of policy positions, and we are definitely defenders of DC home rule and proponents of statehood. So does any open for questions if folks have questions for Brianna?
And again, you can raise your hand, please, and we'll call on you to your question, or you can put it in the chat and I'll read it for you. Anna, I think you need to unmute again. Sorry, we muted you.
I'm just, my instinct is, of course, how in the world to fight back and on each of these, because this is clearly a case for statehood in all of these, because they're just eating away at the integrity of the district. So the question is how one could fight against any one of these, especially the last one. I'm in Chevy Chase, so I would want to call Jamie Raskin. Sure. But how could one fight back on these? Is what is my instinct. What can one do to fight back?
I mean, I think that's an excellent question. Part of it is being here. Folks, and one of the concerns that I had when DC home rule essentially, or excuse me, when the occupation ended, was that many people would think that now we're back to a normal space, that DC is now back to its normal, way of life. And so drawing attention to the fact that these bills exist is part of the battle. Many people don't realize that these pieces of legislation are being worked through the House of Representatives and soon to be worked through the Senate. So I think drawing attention to these pieces of legislation to not just those in the district, but people outside of the district. So if you have, friends, colleagues, connections in other parts of the country, Congress is a national body. And so it's going to take more than just our local presence and our, exercising of our freedom of speech in DC to really move on this legislation. So members are using these pieces of legislation from districts that are completely different from the mentality of DC residents. Some of these, Clay Higgins, who is one of the ones that's introduced the bulk of these bills, he's from Louisiana. And so his district is completely different from DC, and his constituents are, subscribing to these ideologies about crime and the concerns around crime and the beautification of the city. So it's important to raise awareness and attention to others that, these bills exist. It's not, the usurping of some of these authorities is not, the desire of DC residents. And so bringing the attention to other people outside of DC, I think is one of the biggest ways that we can fight back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I know that that's
Yeah.
tough because you don't, there's no central authority or no central way to do this. But I do think writing to members of Congress in other areas, showing up on the Hill and petitioning members of Congress in other places, trying to create essentially a coalition around the antithesis of some of these policies, is one of the I think the biggest strategies that could be used to at least try to mitigate the severity of some of these policies.
It makes me want to look up Clay Higgins, learn more about him. I worked for Louisiana Public Television and wrote a series of historical histories on Louisiana history. Anyway,
Oh,
I
cool.
would makes me want to learn more about him.
Wonderful.
So to fight back.
Thank you for your great question.
Well,
Right. Yeah. Thank you, Anna. I would say also, I guess, would you say stand up, fight back, right? Like, so
Yeah.
the League of the League of Women Voters US has sent a letter to every House member on September 10th, opposing every bill that is an anti-home rule bill. And we, the National League and the DC League, we've signed on to several sign-on letters from coalitions. The latest had 151 organizations on it that go to Hill members. The goal is mostly to shore up allies, and also to put some pressure. And then I think Anne put it in the comments, but we have we do a Substack every week, and in our latest Substack, we had a call to say, reach out to your friends and families in states, because as we know, we all know people who live in states, and contact your senators, because for these bills that pass the House, they're the ones that are the most dangerous, right? Because they have this, that all of them are dangerous, but in terms of where they're moving. But I definitely think whenever we go up to the Hill to talk to members of Congress, they always say they need to hear from their constituents. So our job is one step in addition to, we all get those emails that say, contact your congressperson. Well, first of all, we don't have one. And what we need to do is encourage everybody we know who cares about us here in the district to contact their congresspeople and say, don't vote against anything that undermines democracy in DC. Vote against all of these anti-home rule bills. These, it's not acceptable to even, to further undermine the democracy of DC. And we always talk about how it's an example. DC is often an example of what Congress and other federal officials want to do to the rest of the country. So people should care about what's going on here, because it's kind of a signal of what some of the things they want to do elsewhere around the country. So everybody, what we need, and you'll see, we'll probably put out other calls to keep the drumbeat on, so that people who are, we try to get, I think the House is going to pass a lot of these bills, but the fight is really in the Senate.
And to your,
oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, and to your point about the Senate, Eric Schmidt, who is a member from Montana, he is the chairman of the subcommittee on the Constitution in the Senate Judiciary Committee. And he has been the one in the Senate creating companion bills for some of these House bills, companion bills just being bills that are similar in the Senate so that they can expedite the process for passing. But he has been on crucial committees like the Subcommittee on the Constitution to interpret and reinterpret the way that he believed or believes that the federal government should have authority over DC. One last thing, the caucuses. So some of these members are a part of strong caucuses, including the House Freedom Caucus, as well as the Republican Study Committee and the Senate Western Caucus. These caucuses have taken a stance on the preservation of democracy and the control essentially of DC to do that. So I encourage all of us, in addition to writing to members of Congress and doing other things, to also consider these caucuses as another source of agitation. Because I do think that they are creating coalitions that will prevent some of these or that may encourage some of these bills to go forward.
Yeah.
Right.
So Vanessa, do you have any additional thoughts on this? I also, I do know there are groups that are sending DC residents up to Congress. And I have to say, even I admit in the past, I would have said, not necessarily the most useful thing to do other than when we had structured like advocacy days. But at this point, I think if members of Congress want to make decisions for DC, then, we should show up and tell them that we don't agree with it. And being present can very much help, because if they really want to, run DC, then we have things to we have thoughts
say.
to say. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I would just add to that it is my experience that the average DC resident is involved with multiple national civil rights coalitions, as well as very often a campaign donor to national political organizations. And one thing that we can do is start letting those national organizations know that we view DC rights as a civil rights and voting rights issue. We are working really hard in this space to change how people look at this from it's just a thing. I don't know. It's the cost of living in DC to hey, this is a voting rights issue. If you want to find a group of people who are disenfranchised, go to DC. And really working to use your dollars that go to support these national either political campaigns or national democracy or civil rights groups, and saying that you care about this issue will change the framing of this conversation from being a political fight to a civil rights issue. So I would just encourage you not to feel like just because you don't have a vote in Congress, you don't have a voice. You do have a voice. You may just have to exert your pressure a little bit differently. And you're lucky to be here with the League of Women Voters, who has already made this a national issue, but not every national organization with local chapters does that.
Great, thanks. Let's see, I see great advice in the comments, but not. Oh, Linda Finella. I see a question from Linda.
Thank you so much for the recognition. I am also, I'm not only am I a member of the League, but I'm also the Social Justice Chair for the Washington section of the National Council of Negro Women. And as you know, we have our Purple Rush days. Hello, Ann, there. And so I was just thinking in my mind that I like the idea of that Vanessa said, if you're going to have all this interference with us and this engagement with us, maybe we need to do it the other way. Like she said, maybe we should invite some of them to us, in a forum so that they can talk to us and not talk at us. What does that look like? And I was thinking that should we talk to the folks who are allies of our congressional representative first? Outside, we hear from Congressman Raskin a lot. We hear from him a lot, but who do we not hear from that we know that we should be having some conversations with? That we're not, I don't know. Have we had conversations with the Virginia delegation that may be supportive of us? Have we had any, yeah, I don't know that. That's a good answer. So I just want to say, to Miss Badders Thompson, I just thought that was a great, and it's got my mind spinning. So if that's something that we all want to think about, and I can go back and in my, in our group, and see if that's something that we should think about, and maybe we can coalesce around it and do something together.
I like where you're thinking. It's a great idea. I think we have to think of creative ways to get DC's story told, because the traditional routes are not always there for DC residents. And to answer your question, Maryland's representatives, by and large, have been very supportive, with the notable exception of one who has been a constant challenge for DC autonomy. But we find that Virginia's senators and representatives are much less consistent in supporting DC autonomy and DC's right to govern itself. So it's not always intuitive who stands by us and who doesn't. One source of frustration for me is we often find that representatives or senators that might support us on DC statehood don't stand with us when faced with a crime bill that relates solely to DC residents. So it's a very fluid issue, and I often say we have some fair weather friends, but I think there are ways to ensure that folks are more consistently supportive of DC, and where folks are involved in groups that can exert power, I think we need to be careful and be intentional about talking about this in a way that goes beyond just being a DC problem and representing this as a democracy and a civil rights problem. Because on their best day, Congress has recognized that themselves, as has the Supreme Court. So we've got some backing.
That's right. And I think the growing recognition of it as a civil rights issue has put us, like, there are more national organizations that are involved, but again, there's sometimes fair weather allies as well. So we just need to keep up the drumbeat. And Linda, to your point of also letting people know, or creative ways, as Vanessa said, Anna has a documentary called The Last Battlefront, which talks about the fight for DC autonomy and statehood. Ann Anderson developed a statehood game. We have lots of ways we have other ways to inform people. So I know we're coming up to 8:30. I think Jess is gonna have to remind me how long we set this for. I'm sorry. I did want to, though, touch on the control board, because I think that is the other thing out there that is a risk to our autonomy. I don't think people, those of us who lived in DC in around the 90s probably remember the control board, but most people don't know that authority never went away. It is dormant. So I don't know which one of you wants to just briefly touch on the control board issue.
I think that was under my purview. But in 1995, as Vanessa already mentioned, there were major challenges with the DC government in its fiscal operations. And so DC had a serious budgetary crisis. And in a lot of ways, the federal government saw that as an opportunity to introduce policy that would allow for the president to select essentially a council of people. I think at the time it was 5 people, but there's legislation or information that could allow for additional bodies to serve on that board. But there were 5 people that were essentially appointed by the president to serve on that board in different capacities. And they could oversee operations from the mayor's office, from the DC Council, from the chief financial officer. And so it essentially placed another layer of oversight of the DC government and the DC Council and the mayor. And it was under the auspices of having fiscal responsibility and allowing for the federal government to inculcate itself into a budgetary system that would, help or aid the DC government to correct some of its fiscal challenges. And this was in operation for almost 2 years, right? It was from 1995 to almost 1997 when the board essentially, had solved the issue of DC's finances. But as Anne mentioned, the authority still exists. It no longer is sort of operating, but it's operating in law, if you will, right? The ability to resume this sort of feature still exists. And this happened under President Clinton's administration. And, I think the concern really here is if this authority is left up to presidential oversight, this, could either explicitly increase the role that the federal government has, or if there's a president who, has a good rapport with DC and feels as if DC could solve its own issues, they may constrain the federal government's, position in this, meaning we believe that DC has the authority through Home Rule Act and other things to solve its own crises, right? So if left up to the agency of the president, that is how we're thinking about this control board and their authority, which is a big concern. We've seen, what the existing administration has used to their, advantage in this way, in weaponizing certain features about the control board. So, I mean, that's a very like quick and dirty version of what the control board has done. But I do think the precedent in 1995, but also in 2020, after the murder of George Floyd, is also an indicator of how, the president can essentially use his own authorities through things like the control board and also the Constitution to involve itself in DC operations. Vanessa, do you have anything else? I'm sure
Yeah,
there's
that was a great explanation. I think the one thing I would flag is that there are 7 specific financial sort of triggers under the law, where if any of those triggers are violated, the president's automatically got the authority to reimpose the control board. And that authority continues through, I believe, 4 balanced budgets. So it's not even something that we can get out of in a year. We're sort of locked in for a period of time. And unfortunately, in part because this statute was passed in conditions and with a president that I think there was more trust with, there's no mechanisms in the law for any kind of judicial review. Like it is not set up in a way that there's any sort of due process for DC. It's just if one of these 7 economic conditions are violated, the president picks the members of the control board and we're locked in for a while. So it's something, I think anybody interested in DC autonomy really wants to avoid. But because of some of the other federal actions this year, not necessarily targeted specifically at DC, but things like the federal job cuts and things like moving federal agencies out of DC, those are all having big economic impacts on the city. And they're moving us closer to a scenario in which one of those 7 triggers could be violated or, triggered.
Wow.
I placed in the chat a really great NPR story about the control board and some of the history behind it. I thought it was helpful.
Yeah, thanks. Including that one of the reasons DC, I hope it mentions that one of the reasons that DC was in a fiscal crisis is that when we got home rule, we also inherited the pension debt of all the federal employees who were running DC and were just turned over to DC agencies. So the federal government has a large role in lots of challenges that we face. So Jess, I see your hand up.
Yep, I have another question from the chat. Linda asked, do you think that once our neighbors understand that their youth may be impacted by the new juvenile justice laws, that may have an impact on how they should work with our legislators? So do we think that will be a call to action for members of our community?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends. So some of the policy in that legislation is mirroring authorities in other districts, in other places. So there's already an impetus for this sort of crackdown on crime and changing the age at which someone can be charged as an adult. So I think it depends on the area or the district or, the region that you're, trying to find bipartisan or, excuse me, coalitions. But I mean, I think it can, raising awareness about these issues anyway is, I think, important for not just DC residents, but for the nation, as, what we talked about earlier, which is that this is an infringement upon extended authorities and civil rights. So couching this under that auspices, I think is helpful generally. Who sort of hears that message, I think depends upon where you're looking and what area you're looking in. But I think generally this can be a helpful gospel to try to send to the public.
Yeah. Oh, I see Ann Anderson and then Anna Gerard.
So I thank you all so much for what you have been saying. And it really underscores for me, once again, that this is not about crime. It really is about normalizing the takeover and the militarization of our police and our criminal justice system so that it'll be okay when people show up at the ballot box in 2026 because we're being protected by horrible things by, fully armed National Guardsmen at the ballot box. And it really is important to me, I think, that we really focus on the fact that we're often used as a petri dish. We're often used as a petri dish. I mean, the whole thing with I have absolutely nothing against charter schools, except for the fact that we voted against putting public money into it. And that was completely ignored. So those are the kinds of things. And we were used as a petri dish to see how it would work. So, when you reach out to people in the 50 states and you say, here's what's happening, and this could happen to you tomorrow unless you get it stopped in Washington, D.C. And you can stop it in Washington, D.C. if you talk to your member of Congress and you say, I hate what you're doing. And you don't have to be an expert. You just say, hey, buddy, I don't like this. And I'm not going to vote for you unless you do something about it. I'm done with the rant.
And I think I totally take your point. It's excellent. And, one of the concerns too with DC is that we don't really have a buffer, right? There's no governor, in that way. And most of the occupations that we've seen, the governor has been the approver of these policies. We don't have that same privilege. And so it's such a concern in the level of oversight that comes from the federal government here.
Anna? Oh, you're muted, Anna.
I just want to say this is very helpful, and two things. I want to make sure that I can get a copy of this, and it's a copy of especially of the notes that are in the chat. Afterwards, I would like to be able to get a copy of that myself. But I also I learned, and I mentioned this to Anne, that my film has been accepted to go national on April 1st, 2026 to 350 PBS stations nationwide. And I only say this, that I want to recommend that this can be an opportunity for all of us to make a case for all of us to go to all the states with the case for the District of Columbia, and to where we can collaborate to all the different states, to take the case to the states, because it reaches 350 PBS stations 80 million people. And we've been developing also downloadable lesson plans that will be free lesson plans for students, high school students, that will go along with the film. But this is only one piece of it. This is just there are other materials that could accompany this. So I just would like to be able to partner with others or collaborate with others, because it could go along with the film when it goes out, with the league or with the DC, with Free DC or with others, could make this a national campaign for the district. I just want to recommend that. Okay.
That's great. Well, congratulations, Anna. I know you've been working to get it on national distribution.
Yeah.
So that's great. And I know Anna Anderson, we've always thought about, like, once it goes national, do we do league events around it? I'd also like to point out that 2026 is our 250th birthday. I can't remember how to say the word.
Exactly.
And Anne and I and some others have been brainstorming around how do we raise awareness of DC statehood at a time when we're celebrating, the birth of our nation, and the reason we fought a revolution was taxation without representation. But it turns out it's alive and well in the nation's capital. Like, we're thinking about how we can use it to amplify the message. And we also realize that it's 225 years since we were disenfranchised because Congress moved to DC in 1801 and took away our vote. So if anyone here wants to help us think about that, that would be fabulous. That would be.
I would like
helpful.
to collaborate with whoever wants to join on this, because it's set to go on April 1st. That's the launch date. So I just wanted to say, would like to be able to collaborate and make a national campaign on behalf of the district. That's the only reason I'm bringing this up. So.
Well, thanks. I appreciate that. And then I think we also talked about, if folks have suggestions for action in the chat, we will send out, we'll check with the presenters if they want to share their PowerPoints, but the league, we've developed an action, a one-pager on actions you can do. We also have one-page talking points on how to talk about our occupation to friends and family. I know Brianna has a very detailed list on the bills. We've been tracking the bills as well. And we have a Substack where every week we just give updates on what's going on. And then occasionally also try to share some DC joy, because one of the reasons we fight so hard for autonomy is that we have a pretty fabulous, we have a pretty fabulous district, right? So, which passes great laws and, works to help people thrive. And I think just to hammer home again, a lot of the bills that Brianna walked through, they actually overturn laws that we, our elected officials, have passed, and they're reaching in and undoing them.
Right.
So I think definitely I appreciate everyone's enthusiasm for what to do. And we definitely have suggestions, and now we even have something to do in April 2026. So when everyone's watching Anna's show on PBS. So do you have any other thoughts? I think we can sort of work to wrap up. I see Jess popping in.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I'm just trying to track based on who's on the call and who registered so that we know who to send it to. So if you're on this call and you'd like to receive those resources, if you could just put your email address in the chat right now, that way we can make sure that we have your permission to email you and we caught your name, because I don't have any other way of knowing you were here if I don't have you registered on our website. So just take a minute to do that while we do our final wrap up. Thanks.
Okay. I see people are putting in their emails. So I guess, actually, speaking of final wrap up, let's talk about DC Joy. So what is it? Brianna, you said you moved here, right? When did you move here?
2022.
2022.
The end of 2022.
Yeah. So what is it that you moved to? What in the district? What did you get? Like, what did you not expect when you found when you were here?
What did I not expect?
Yeah.
Let's see. Well, I moved from Philadelphia, so I was in a pretty big city, the 6th largest in the country. And I didn't expect it to feel so similar in certain ways. I think there are there are pockets of DC that have different feels to them. And I wasn't in Philadelphia, you certainly feel that. You feel, pockets of creative towns or pockets of, school. There are a lot of schools in Philadelphia, but I didn't expect it to feel like little hubs of different communities. You just kind of hear DC and you think of it as this big or bigger group, but no, they're like little nooks and things that I have enjoyed exploring.
Oh, thank you. Vanessa?
Yeah, so I will say that I share the same love of DC's scale. I always think of it as scale because I grew up partially outside of New York City. And one of the things about New York City is particularly Manhattan, is not built at a human scale. And one of the things I love about DC is you have these great neighborhoods interspersed with these wonderful parks and outdoor spaces that for me is really what makes DC livable as a city. As someone who very much grew up barefoot outdoors in the woods, it's like this really nice combination of like the urban resources, the arts community, the restaurants. We've got amazing museums, but then we got green space right next door, and I love that. I will also say I love the people in DC. I moved down here when I moved down to college. It was a while ago now, last century actually, and I stayed in part because I felt like, again, my context was New York City. And in New York City, the big thing is money. Everybody moves to New York City to get rich. And in DC, it felt like people moved to DC often because they had a passion, or they stayed in DC because they had a passion. So for me, there's something about the people here and the people who choose to stay here that was very different than what I was used to.
Yeah. Could I just add, I'm a local in terms of where I grew up. I grew up in Maryland, went to high school in Maryland, an all girls Catholic high school, actually. And so I'm essentially coming home, but I love the proximity to other places like Maryland and like Virginia. My parents live in Maryland, so it's great proximity wise. You can get to places in a very short period of time. So it's such a great benefit to living in the district.
Yeah, I have to say I have lived for shorter or longer periods of time in the district ever since 1989, kind of hopped in and out. And I will still never forget how amazing it to me. It was like how DC loves Halloween, right? And I was like, it's such a buttoned down city, especially in the, it was so buttoned down and like, and it just loves Halloween, like Georgetown and like, the high heel race before, I mean, I just thought that was such one of the funniest and quirkiest things about DC, to show that it's actually way more interesting than people always made it out to be, right? I have to say now, the longer I've lived here, what I really appreciate is I have DC Department and Rec. They do so many things to make it really there's not only all the sports, but they put on all these events that people can participate in, and they're trying to help people thrive. I mean, there are lots of challenges with the city, obviously,
Sure.
but I do feel like the district government through Department of Rec really tries to make DC a livable city, and I really appreciate that. So, all right, I think we have everybody's emails in? I appreciate everyone for joining us, and I thank you so much, Brianna and Vanessa, for such a thorough and thoughtful and helpful also discussion of where we stand right now, and and we have our work cut out for us, I have to say, but we can also do it, right? We're in community and we have lots of folks who are already active, so we really, really appreciate it.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for
Thanks so
tuning
much.
in. Hope to see you soon.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.